Hey folks, this is Alan from Important Fun, talking this week about act structure and how to use that in Dungeons & Dragons and other role-playing games. Now this is something that I'm not really an expert in any way. I didn't even take drama or anything in high school or college, but it's something I've been reading a lot about lately, something I became interested in to use in my games, and I don't actually know how effective it's been, but it's something I find really interesting, and I think you can definitely get at least a few things from thinking about this for your games. So first thing I want to talk about is 3-act structure. This has become super popular, especially in Hollywood, with the publication of a book by a guy named Sid Field, all about screenwriting, and it's kind of become the blueprint for movies, especially in Hollywood in the latter half of the 20th century and today. And so this takes a story and divides it up into 3 acts. It starts with an inciting incident, ends with a climax, and in between you've got a midpoint or turning point and a couple plot points that sort of launch the action from one act to another. And so I won't go super detailed about each of these, but basically Act 1 is the setup. So this is where we're introduced to the protagonist, possibly the antagonist, what's going on, what's going to drive the story. Act 2 is confrontation. So this is when the stakes get raised. This is the bulk of the movie. This is where we start to force the protagonist to make some sort of decision, which usually comes right at the midpoint. It's actually kind of disappointing now that I know about this to see that when I'm watching a movie or reading a book, how often the turning point, the midpoint, comes literally in the exact middle of the story. For example, spoilers for The Godfather, but The Godfather is a movie all about Michael Corleone, who starts out as sort of not wanting to get into the family mafia business, and eventually he does. And the real turning point where he ends up murdering 2 guys, and for the first time really committing a crime like that, comes almost exactly in the dead center of the film. And then we move into Act 3, resolution. This is where we basically resolve whatever dramatic question we've been trying to solve throughout this movie. So this is where, the midpoint is where Michael Corleone takes that step to now he's in the mafia. Act 3 is where we resolve all the questions that have been raised in the throughout the entire movie. We can contrast that with 5-act structure. So 5-act structure takes a story and divides it into 5 parts. If you notice, they're pretty similar. You've got the exposition, setting things up, then rising action as we go towards that midpoint I talked about, which is called the climax here, not to be confused with what we usually think of a climax as coming at the end of a movie. This is from some of Aristotle's terminology. And then the falling action, which again doesn't necessarily mean that it's after the main event of the story and we're winding things down, just that the climax is the turning point where from this point on we're headed towards the showdown. And then the denouement, where sort of tying up loose ends, resolving things. And so both these structures, if you see, have sort of a wave type of pattern where you're building things up and then you're reaching a certain point where there's no turning back and everything just kind of crashes down. And so for Dungeons & Dragons, where the Dungeon Master doesn't have complete control over the story, has maybe even very little control over the story, some might say, I think thinking of it in looser terms like this is much more effective than trying to jam things into, oh, well, we're entering into Act 3 of the story. And I especially think it's useful to think of this fractally. So fractals where a larger piece is made up of smaller pieces that look the same, like these triangles here. And what I mean by this is that a scene or an encounter, or whatever you want to call it in your game, that can have something of that act structure, that, building up to something and then resolving it. And then you can also think of one session of your game, whether that's a dungeon or more, free form, having that same sort of structure. First you want to set something up, building to a point of no return, and then working towards resolving that in a huge climax, and then resolution. And then you can also think of that, at the multi-level level for Dungeons and Dragons, where over the course of several games, as your players level up, you can really use that to explore some of the questions of your characters' backstories. And like I said, as a dungeon master, you don't have nearly the control that a writer or filmmaker does, but you can sort of use some of this stuff as ideas that, like, if I want to try and coax one of these player characters into an arc, and let's say I want it to last 4 levels, that means that maybe you can spend the first level sort of setting things up you want to explore, and then put a minor turning point at the end of that first level. And then halfway through, that's where you can give the characters some sort of decision, like give them a turning point. This can be hard to do, obviously, if you've got like 5 or 6 players, but doing it all at the same time feels a little forced and a little hard to do. But that's something to think about when you're designing a campaign arc, that arc structure, that wave of building and building to the point of no return and then resolving. So hopefully that's useful for you to think about. Like I said, you probably won't want to go read Sid Field or Freytag or any of the other, or Aristotle, any of the people who have written about dramatic structure in the past, but maybe give some like Wikipedia pages a cursory glance. Think about what you can take from this and put into your game. As always, you can find me online on Twitter at ImportantFun or at ImportantFun.com. And thank you very much for watching. We'll see you next week.